Hello Book Club. We've recently changed the format on how we're doing all these videos. We're going to do kind of a rapid review for everything at the beginning. Just give scores, real quick points on this was good, that was good, whatever, without too many spoilers, very light spoilers that won't ruin the book for you, won't ruin the show for you, won't give too much away. And then at some point we'll stop and we'll get into Geek Out Time, where we'll get into all the details. I think this will add more substance to the reviews. I think it'll allow us to kind of talk about the things we want to talk about where we've been hamstrung before. And it'll also make the rapid review part a lot more rapid, I hope. With all that being said, today's book is Ship of the Line. It's a Star Trek novel. This is a thrift store find. Every once in a while, I go to thrift stores and I'll find some random book and I'll decide that looks interesting. I'll read the cover, be like, okay, I'll try that. Generally in the science fiction areas. I have read most of the Star Wars canon or non-canon books now. I was reading all of the Star Wars books up until about the latest trilogy of movies came out, and there's been a whole host of media, books included, coming out to fill in and explain, I guess, what happened in those last three movies, which, good luck with that. But that being said, I've read the vast majority of the Star Wars books out there, but I've never read a Star Trek book. This is my first Star Trek Ship of the Line, and I have to say, I was surprised. It was really, really good. Maybe I'm biased. I'm a Trekkie, or a Trekker, or whatever is vogue now to call somebody who likes Star Trek. I'm that. Which means it's kind of odd that I've never read a Star Trek book and I read all these Star Wars books, but that's probably just because I got into the Star Wars books through a friend and it happened. I might not have ever read the Star Wars books had it not been for that friend. Overall, I gave this book a 7. That's a good score. This is a read the book. If you're into Star Trek, it's kind of a must read. Yeah, I'd categorize it as a must-read. If you're not into Star Trek, it's a read, I guess, if you like science fiction at all. If you've never read or seen anything out of Star Trek before, I don't know how you could, but if you've never seen a Star Trek episode, if you've never seen a movie or read anything else Star Trek related, you could pick up this book, read it, and still enjoy it. For the specific categories for plot, I gave it a 7.5. The story was good. So, just to set it up, if you remember the Star Trek The Next Generation episode where the Enterprise gets stuck in a time loop over and over again, repeating what's going on, and the characters start to anticipate what's going to happen. Like, it begins with a card game, and all of a sudden, after a few iterations of this time loop, some of the players can start guessing what the next cards are, and they're confused about that and why that's happening. And it goes through a number of iterations while they figure it out, what's going on. The ship blows up a couple of times. And eventually they set up a way for Data to pass on a message, but it has to be super simple. And that message is 3. Well, at the critical moments before the explosion, Riker has 3 pips, right? 3 that signifies his rank, and that tells Data, I need to do what he's telling us to do, and he does it, and it saves the ship. The ship that the Enterprise hit a number of times and almost hit in the last iteration of that time loop is called the Boseman, and it's captained by Captain, I'm going to say Bateson. Bateson? B-A-T-E-S-O-N? Bateson. Captain Bateson. In the show, he was played by Kelsey Grammer. So the book takes place shortly after Enterprise D was destroyed. And the Enterprise D crew really, they've got nowhere to be. They're kind of adrift in their careers. They're trying to stay together, but, there are forces pulling them apart, obviously. Starfleet's going to need them other places. In this future, at Starbase 12, they're finishing building a ship, which will eventually become Enterprise E. I believe it's the Sovereign class ships, the first of the Sovereign class. With the Enterprise D destroyed, it looks like this one will be Enterprise E, and it does become Enterprise E, as you probably know from the movies that took place after. Some of the other central characters are the crew of the Boseman. the ship that was pulled forward into time and nearly collided with the Enterprise. Now, these people are never talked about again in the TV series, so it's great that this book kind of explores what happened to them after the fact, them coping with, or not coping very well, with being pulled into the future, going back into service for Starfleet, most of them, because their personal lives, obviously they're hundreds of years in the future, or 100 years or more. Their family has moved on or passed on at this point, so this is a story about that crew, in part. It's a story about what happened to the Enterprise crew after the Enterprise D was destroyed. It's where they kind of mingle, they come together, these people cross paths. As an added bonus, we have an extra character, Scotty, who is another time traveler that ended up in the Next Generation series via a transporter loop thing. Everybody's looping into the future. So Scotty plays a fairly decent part in this particular story. So you've got these ingredients, great ingredients, leftover storylines from the Next Generation TV series, filling a gap in time that hasn't been explored. But do we have a good story in the meantime? Yes, we do. This story centers around an old conflict with the crew of the Boseman pulled into the future, and Klingons being very long-lived. Bateson has enemies from his era who think along the lines of the Federation versus Klingon era when we were. Yeah, I was there. I was totally there when the Federation was more at odds with the Klingon Empire. I'm not going to say there's sort of a peace, I guess, in the Next Generation timeline, but who's ever really at peace with the Klingons for long? Perhaps because they're such a long-lived species, it takes them a lot longer to adapt and change over time and grow, and peace is still a very new thing to them. So some of Bateson's old enemies come back and start trouble. On top of that, and weaved into this story, is one of the Next Generation episodes where Picard was captured by Cardassians and tortured. So there's a lot of cleanup, I guess, after the series, or it weaves in a lot of the interesting aspects. Very good episodes, I would say, of Star Trek: The Next Generation. It weaves in a lot of the leftover threads into this particular story. I think the short of it is it would have made a really good movie. For the characters, I gave it a 7.5. Now, I'm not concentrating so much on the normal Next Generation characters, which were so-so when the show first came out, but had that time to develop, and developed very, very well over time. Instead, I'm going to concentrate on the new characters that are introduced. Captain Bateson's a very interesting character. He's, I guess, somewhat pedantic. He's into words, their history. There's a very long, starts with an E word that covers that, etymology. That's a random guess. That's wrong. Anyway, he's into words, and he brings them up all the time, the history of a word. Someone will use a word, and it brings up the history of it. And it's how it's used, that could be off-putting to most people, but his whole crew's in on it. And they get involved, and it becomes somewhat of a bonding thing for them. Speaking of his crew, they mesh really well together. They're a great team, and they were a very tight-knit group. His second officer, I think it's Gabe Bush. He has the most character development. Gabe has his own ups and downs and makes for a very interesting character in the end. And some of the Starfleet officers and civilian space mariners, I guess is one way to put it, that get captured by Madrid, and while they're in their torture simulations, you could do entire multi-part episodes or mini-series on just their experiences. And you'll see that pacing kind of suffers for that. There's just so much to cover, and it jumps around a lot. So pacing kind of suffers for that. It's still done fairly well, but it does suffer for it. Speaking of pacing, and for those reasons, I gave pacing a 6. So it was 7.5 for story, 7.5 for characters, and 6 so far for pacing. For prose, I gave it a 6 as well. It's good. There's nothing that really sticks out. It reads like a Next Generation episode. It reads like the movie. Prose there is sometimes profound, sometimes not. It does get profound here and there, which is why it's not a 5. 5 is average. It's above average. And then for places, I gave it a 7. You know, this is the Star Trek universe. It's interesting. It's above average in how it's presented in all the episodes. I'd say it's presented a little bit better here in this book, but maybe that's just because it's a book. Books take the time to describe things a little bit better, as opposed to having to rely on sets and being constrained by budgets and special effects and all of those things. A book just gets to throw words on a piece of paper to get your imagination to do most of the work. Overall, I'll give it a 7. I'll save the rest for geeking out. All right, geek out time. Spoilers, spoilers, spoilers. I think I talked too much earlier about this particular book in the non-geek out time part. I'm not used to having an opportunity to just get into as much detail as I want. But here we go. We'll cover a little bit more. One of the interesting storylines in this particular book was the fact that Picard was wrestling with the fact that should he be a captain of a ship anymore. His crew, of course, was pushing him to do that, and they were all avoiding being reassigned, trying to stay together on the starbase so that they could all basically just move from the D to the E without losing anybody. So that was their goal, but Picard wasn't so sure about it. He was wrestling with the fact that he lost the Stargazer, his first ship, his first command, and now he lost the Enterprise D, his second command, and he lacked faith in himself. One of the things that they did is they gave him a mission to go to Cardassia. I think Cardassia Prime is what it says in the book. But to go rescue people who were being tortured like he was from Madrid. That Cardassian torturer who was torturing people against all kinds of agreements and treaties. It was illegal what he was doing. They gave him a mission that was, I think this was intentional by the Admiralty. They gave him a mission that was going to stoke his fires. As part of his processing the loss of the Enterprise D and reestablishing himself in his own mind as a good commander, he was running simulations that Riker gave him that was Captain Kirk. It's kind of like a deep fake, a modern deep fake, where they took everything, all the information they had, all the reports he ever wrote, all the video they ever had, everything they had on him, and combined it into this program to make it as realistic Kirk as possible. So he worked out the issues he was having with Kirk as he was traveling to Cardassia to rescue these people, and before. So they had these interesting interactions with James D. Kirk. I didn't mention that before because I want that to be a surprise. I like to not mention things in the reviews that are not supposed to have spoilers so that people can be surprised by them, like I was. And that was one of those surprises that I enjoyed. Maybe I shouldn't have mentioned that Scotty was in it, but I was talking about people from the past coming up. And Scotty plays a pretty good part in this one. You know, he's at one point, and I guess this is spoiler heavy, I can do this. I can say this. At one point, he's on the Enterprise E, and they're not in control of that ship. The Klingons are in control of that ship, but he's loose. So he's causing all kinds of havoc with the systems. And when you set Scotty in an Enterprise, in a Starfleet ship, to just wreak havoc, it's kind of fun to see what he comes up with, messing with the gravity plating and all environmental controls. I mean, they made stink bombs. You know, I think that was Bateson's idea, but they made stink bombs to mess with the Klingons, and so bad that they were retching and they couldn't fight. You know, it was a good book. You know, there was a lot of great parts about it. The torture aspects, the people being tortured currently by Madrid, and they weren't like tortured individually. When I say simulations, I mean I think they're called Madrid cities or something like that. Madrid camps. I can't remember exactly what the terminology was, but essentially they were placed there and then constantly attacked, and they were testing how they would survive, how they would, you know, band together, work together so that they can... His whole goal is to eventually defeat the Federation. Everybody not Cardassian is his enemy. You know, there's no potential enemy or enemy. So Madrid has a very dark outlook on everybody else, but he's also torturing his own people to learn their weaknesses. So I don't know where I was going with that point. I get to ramble now because I'm geeking out. So I'm just going to ramble occasionally, and you'll have to deal with it. I liked Gabe's arc in this particular book. It is a book, you've got more time to tell the story, but it still feels like an episode or a movie where you've got so much to say, and you're jumping around and skipping steps and things like that. You're hitting the important steps, right? They hit the important steps, but people make huge advancements off screen, so to speak, off book. And one of those huge advancements would be Gabe. So Gabe's arc was very interesting. He was upbeat and he was about to be married, and then they got pulled into the future. Well, his fiancée that he left behind never stopped looking for him and ended up in a bad way for it, exhausted every effort, thought that they were captured and obviously the ship disappeared in their timeline and nobody was ever able to find it. Starfleet tried and then eventually gave up, and she never stopped. Well, she was eventually, I think she was captured by Klingons and died in prison. I can't remember exactly, but it was bad. So he was a wreck ever since, a drunk and a wreck. And Bateson, understanding that, was sheltering him from the normal Starfleet punishments and reassignments and demotions and all of that stuff that would normally go with the behavior that he was exhibiting. He makes a complete comeback in this story, but most of it happens off screen. You can see it starting to happen. You can see him starting to get pushed in that direction by Riker in particular, but it doesn't completely happen until he's off screen. Once he's off screen, and he has these, he's basically the high man on the totem pole for another group of people stuck on a ship, and he's got to step up. I'm assuming most of this because it happens off screen, but it seems like he stepped up, took on the challenge, and really knocked it out of the park. So Gabe's back, and that's a great part of the end of the book. I said earlier that Star Trek can be sometimes very profound. When Captain Picard rescues the other Starfleet officers and other people being tortured, that's kind of a profound moment when he gets news almost immediately that the Enterprise is heading in a bad direction to destroy some people, not to give away all the spoilers. Well, I can, right? I can. He gets communication that he needs to immediately jump into action, so he just takes all these people who have been starved and tortured through combat exercises over and over again. He takes them and immediately goes, all right, we're breaking up among these 3 ships and we're going to go take care of this right now if you're game. And he gives Phil promotions and he's like, all right, let's do this. And that's a pretty good moment. Some of Picard's speech, and Picard's speeches in general, his monologues and his speeches are where the authors generally take liberties to be profound, to speak to big issues. He's the voice of most of those things. He's the deep thinker. He's the diplomat. Man, I really don't know what to do with this geek out stuff. I don't know what to talk about. I could just talk more about the book and go on and on and on. But I'm curious to know what you guys think. What do you think about Gabe's progression? What do you think about the fact that basically Picard and Riker were in the book, but nobody else? Worf is off at Deep Space Nine at this time, I think, so he's not even a part of the crew, technically. And what did you think about being behind the eyes of Picard and Riker? It's one thing to be behind the eyes of these other characters from Star Trek that you don't know much about, like Bateson and all those, but to be in the mind of, and seeing things through the eyes of Riker and Picard was very odd to me. Riker more so than Picard. I think it just goes to show how well those actors acted those roles, in that you always felt like you were behind their eyes. You always felt like you were seeing things from their perspective, when really you weren't. You were just watching them on the screen. You felt like you were a part of the crew. But when you're reading the book, you really are kind of more a part of the crew because you're more enmeshed in it. You've got that extra perspective of their thoughts as opposed to just their actions and their words. What do you guys think about seeing these characters on a screen and now seeing the world from their eyes? The world, probably not good phrasing since they're traveling in space among many worlds and places. I'm often surprised about how Earth-centric our language is. The world, we often say for all of existence, instead of saying seeing existence through. That just sounds weird, right? Seeing all of existence through their eyes. And what did you think about filling in some of the gaps between the movies and the end of the series? Seeing the inception of the Enterprise E, or the final preparatory days of building, final prep for Enterprise E, knowing that it had a different captain at the outset. Basically what I'm asking is, what did you think about all these things? It's a unique experience for me to read a Star Trek book since I've never done it before. But I've seen every episode of every series at least twice, if not more, especially Next Generation. And I've seen every movie probably more times than that. Have you ever read a Star Trek book? What do you think? What should I read next in this world, this catalog of Star Trek books that are out there? I see plenty of them at the thrift store. Should I just grab them all? All right, book club, I'll see you later. Maybe next time we'll be better at breaking things up between the spoiler side, geek out side, and the non-geek out, hey, I don't want to spoil too much side of things. It can only get better unless it gets worse.